have an explanation for.
Four.
Four. And I'm going to list them very quickly.
Okay.
And then I want you to use what your Quran says to explain these historical facts.
Okay, that's fair, that's fair.
Okay, I'm going to list the 12.
We can, but I cannot answer this
let me
right away.
finish. Let me finish.
Let
me finish.
You have already prepared.
Let me finish. So, ladies and gentlemen, these are the 12 facts. I'm going to list them. Jesus died by crucifixion. Jesus was buried in a tomb. Disciples despaired and felt hopeless because of the crucifixion. The tomb was empty a few days later. The disciples believed they experienced a literal appearance of a risen Jesus Christ. The disciples were transformed by that experience. Jesus' resurrection was the central message of the early church. The disciples proclaimed the resurrection in Jerusalem, where Jesus had been crucified. As a result of their preaching, the church grew. Sunday became the primary day of Christian worship. James, who was skeptical of his half-brother Jesus, converted to Christianity. Paul, who was a persecutor of the early church, converted to Christianity. Now, using your Quran and what your Quran states, explain to me these historical events. Right, justify that statement.
The Quran makes theological points. It doesn't make historical points as crucified, but it doesn't have to go into history. It makes theological points. That's, I don't know.
Okay.
You're asking for something that's not there, so it's not there. Just to be clear, but it doesn't have to explain these things.
Okay, so the answer to the challenge is justified. It is a fair response. It is to say that the Quran doesn't have to explain these points. I agree. There is no moral obligation upon the Quran to explain these historical events. However, the fact remains that these historical events did happen. Historians believe them. Real historians believe them. And the reality is, if you take the Quranic story seriously, which is that Christ was not crucified, someone like him was crucified in his place, that explains the first point, that Jesus died by crucifixion. It explains the second point, that Jesus was buried in a tomb. It explains the third point, that the disciples despaired and felt hopeless, but it does not answer any of the points, such as the empty tomb, the transformation of the apostles' outlook, the fact that they started treating Sunday as an important day of the week, the fact that the resurrection was central to the early Christian message even before Paul.
But these things are explained properly in the Bible. And
yes.
There is a clear message in the Quran. God said that if you need to know things which is not in the Bible, you can go to the previous books.
Right.
That's the first one. Second one, you know my opinion about Jesus' resurrection. I believe that Jesus was on the cross, and it is in line with the Quran.
And that he died.
And he died and he rose up again.
And that's what you believe the Quran states.
And there is a free, so far, Muslim scholar they have believed that.
What are those Muslim scholars?
He doesn't want to hear the truth.
He's running away.
You triggered him.
Yeah, but I need to
Right, so who are the three scholars that say that the Quran agrees with the Bible that Jesus Christ was
the
crucified?
first one is Umran Hussain.
Yeah.
He's a very famous scholar. He's from Pakistan.
Yep. Can I get a bottle of water, please? I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Yep. Go on. Who's the second?
And the second one is...
You pull them up. While you're pulling them up, do you agree with him that that's what the Quran states? What do you think the Quran states?
I agree with the mystery,
Which is?
he wasn't crucified in the first place, because it states clearly he was not crucified, he was not killed.
So let us assume that you're correct. Right? How do you explain the fact of the empty tomb?
I don't have to explain the fact that he killed.
Well, you do, because the first Christians proclaimed a risen Jesus.
What can I present to you a problem with the story of the empty tomb? Because okay, so for example, I've heard the rabbi say this, and the way they found out about the empty tomb is the three women, or however women they were.
Yeah.
They went to the tomb to get the spices and went to the tomb, and then they found that the tomb was empty. However, he explained that there was no reason for them to go, and that would be the stupidest thing to do. And that's why it didn't happen. And the reason is because the spices are used so that the dead body does not stick.
Yeah.
So it's used for the burial. When the burial happens, takes place, people do not smell the bad smell.
Yep.
And after the burial, there is no reason for someone to go to get the spices and go to put the spices on someone when the thing is done, when he's in the tomb. So the story doesn't make sense.
The mass Christian.
No, that's the argument.
My knowledge.
No, let me reply to him, and then you can reply as well. Because we got three different opinions here. One Muslim who thinks that Quran teaches that Christ was dead and crucified, and one who doesn't believe that the Quran teaches that, and then the Christian position. But you're making the argument from people like Rabbi Tovia Singer.
Yep.
This is the kind of argument that counter-missionaries make. But the reality is, the Jews like Rabbi Tovia Singer are making their arguments from 5th century Talmudic teachings. 5th century Talmudic teachings do not account for 1st century Judaic practices. There are lots of things that are normative to Judaism after the 5th century that are not normative to the 1st century. What we have are historical records that demonstrate that Jews did go to their tombs in the 1st century to anoint them with spices. We've got 1st century documentation. They're called the Gospels.
Yes.
What you're arguing from is rabbinic 5th century traditions. That's 5 centuries too late.
Well, you told that too many times that is the case. Well, however, if all your documents are the Gospels, then you rely on the Gospels as a historical record. I wouldn't take them as a single historical record. So I thought when you said there are historical documents that demonstrate that people used to do this in the 1st century, I assume there was some place other than the Gospels. But if it's only in the Gospels, then I wouldn't take it seriously.
Right, hold on one second. Because I'm going to demonstrate to you that there are historical sources that show that burying the crucified condemned man was normative in the 1st century.
I'm not saying
No, let me finish. Because what I'm demonstrating to you is if I'm demonstrating that it's normative to bury the crucified man, then that is extra biblical sources that support the evidence of the gospel.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, the burial
Yeah.
and putting the spices
Is that
in
the
someone
fan I'm gonna
is two
use?
different things.
No. You have not shown me any
there
reason
a
to
purpose
doubt.
for
All you've
this
done is
packet?
make the same conjecture that Rabbi Tovia Singer is making.
No.
Okay.
Show me why I should believe it.
Well, for one, the reason.
Yeah,
No, don't assert. Give me historical evidence to show.
Well, I don't have. I'm not Jewish. I'm not.
Right. Exactly. You're not a Jew and you're not familiar. You're repeating what you heard from a Rabbi Tovia Singer video, and that's what you're repeating.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, exactly. But the point is, Rabbi Tovia Singer throws everything in the kitchen sink at the idea of the Christian faith. But the reality is, I'm about to show you 1st century evidence that corresponds with the testimony that we have in the Gospels. So my evidence is entirely 1st century.
Based on history.
Yes, based on history. I'm making a historical argument. You're making an argument from the 20th century by Rabbi Tovia Singer, who's using 5th century documents to base his criticism of Christianity. It's 5 centuries too late.
We'll see. Okay.
So, listen to this is what Josephus Flavius writes. And Josephus Flavius was a 1st century historian who wrote about the Jewish wars and the revolt in 70 AD. He was made by the Sanhedrin at the birth of the revolt the governor of, I believe, Galilee. But when he realized the game was up, he swapped sides, he became a Roman, and then he wrote a history to curry favor with the Romans. But this is what he wrote, speaking about the murder of the high priests in Jerusalem during the revolt. Listen to what he says carefully. In Jewish Wars 4:317, are you listening? They actually went so far in their impiety as to cast out the corpses without burial. Though the Jews are so careful about funeral rites, that even malefactors who have been sentenced to crucifixion are taken down and buried before sunset. So Josephus is contrasting the behavior of the rebels